I blocked my mother's number for 4 years. Her phone bill still had my name on the plan. People will let you believe you've cut them off completely because correcting you costs them more than the misunderstanding does. I found that out on a Tuesday afternoon in a Verizon store on Northeast Broadway in Portland, 4 years and 2 months after I'd blocked my mother's number. Staring at a customer service representative's screen that showed my name still listed as a line on an account billed to Linda Bishop, my mother, current balance paid in full, 4 years running. What I did wrong is simple enough that I don't need to soften it for you. My mother asked me for $4,000 to help with a medical bill she couldn't cover on her own. I refused her in a way designed to end the conversation permanently, and then I blocked her number, so I wouldn't have to hear what refusing her sounded like a second time. I'll tell you up front that I'm not sharing this so you'll rush to feel sorry for me, and I'd ask you to hold off on that instinct for a while if it starts to show up early, because I hadn't earned it at the point in this story where you'd feel it, and I'm not entirely sure I've earned it by the end either. I did something deliberate to a woman who spent 26 years on her feet at a diner counter, making sure everyone around her, family and strangers alike, had what they needed before she ever thought about what she needed herself. I'd rather you sit with that plainly for a while before I let you feel any better about it. My name is Maya Bishop. I'm 33 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I'm a senior financial analyst at a wealth management firm downtown, a title I've held for a little over 3 years now. I want to walk you through exactly how I got here, because the tidy version of my career story, the one I've told at firm dinners and on 2 different podcasts, leaves out the only part of it that actually explains anything. Let me back up. I need to tell you who my mother was before I tell you what I did to her, because if I start with the phone call itself, you'll misjudge both of us, and I've spent 4 years letting people misjudge her instead of correcting the record myself. My mother, Linda Bishop, waited tables at a diner called the Sunrise Grill on Southeast Powell Boulevard for 26 years, the last 14 of them as the closing shift lead, which meant she was usually the last person out the door most nights, counting the register alone under a single light after everyone else had gone home. She raised me by herself after my father left when I was 4, and she never once, in my hearing, said a bitter word about him, though I know now she spent almost 6 years paying down debt he'd left behind on a joint credit card neither of them had ever fully disclosed to the other. She worked doubles more often than she should have. And she had a specific habit at the diner that the regulars still talk about. According to my Aunt Risa, she kept a coffee can behind the counter, unmarked, that she'd quietly slip a few dollars into from her own tips whenever a regular was clearly having a hard month. And she'd tell them, handing over the extra without ceremony, "This one's on the house today, don't make a thing of it." She never called it charity. She called it taking care of the room. A phrase I heard her use my entire childhood and understood, for most of my life, as simply a nice thing she did for strangers, rather than the entire operating philosophy of how she moved through the world. I remember, distinctly, being maybe 11 years old, sitting at the end of the counter doing homework while my mother worked a Saturday shift, and watching her slide $2 off a struggling young couple's check without either of them noticing until they went to pay. The husband tried to argue with her about it, insisting there'd been a mistake on the bill. And my mother just waved him off and said something about a manager's error on the fryer oil, a made-up excuse she delivered so smoothly I actually believed it myself for a few years afterward. I asked her, walking home that night, why she'd lied about the fryer oil instead of just telling them she'd knocked a few dollars off to help. She said, because if I tell them, then it's a favor they have to feel grateful for. If I don't tell them, it's just what the bill was. Nobody has to carry anything extra that way. I didn't understand, at 11, that she was describing an entire philosophy of giving. I understand it now as the exact same logic behind 8 years of silent cash payments at a Verizon store. She had a phrase she used about our own family's finances, too, one she repeated so often growing up that I could probably recite it in my sleep. We're not rich and we're not poor. We're taken care of. I used to hear that sentence as a kind of gentle denial, a way of making a genuinely tight budget sound softer than it was, and by the time I was in high school, I'd started to resent it slightly. The way teenagers resent almost anything that sounds like it's protecting them from a truth they think they're mature enough to handle. I understand it differently now. I think she meant it literally, every time she said it, that whatever the number in the checking account actually was, the people in our house were never going to go without the thing that mattered most, even if it meant she went without something herself to make that true. The family dynamic worth being honest about is this. It was mostly just the two of us for most of my childhood, until she remarried when I was 14 to a man named Carl. A good, quiet man who worked at a hardware distributor and never once tried to parent me the way a lesser man might have overreached to do. My half-brother Tommy came along when I was 16, and my mother's attention, understandably, split in ways it hadn't had to before, though she'd deny to this day that it ever really changed how she felt about either of us. I'll admit, honestly, that I spent a few teenage years quietly resentful of Tommy's arrival, not because of anything he did, he was a baby, and then a small child. Entirely blameless, but because I'd had my mother's full, undivided attention for 14 years and found the sharing of it harder than I ever let her see. I think that resentment, small and mostly buried, was an early version of the same instinct that would later let me withhold myself from her so completely as an adult. A habit, formed young, of treating her attention and her resources as a finite thing I needed to protect my share of, rather than something she was capable of extending without ever actually running out. I left for the University of Oregon at 18 on a combination of loans, a partial scholarship, and money my mother had been setting aside in a savings account since I was in middle school. $4,000 total by the time I actually needed it, money I know now she'd built up almost entirely from tip income. She never once mentioned skipping things for herself to save. I remember the day she gave me that savings account statement, printed out at the bank because she didn't trust email for something that important. Sliding it across the kitchen table the way she'd slide a discount across a diner counter, saying only, "This is yours. Don't ask me how I did it, just go use it." I didn't ask. I wish, now, that I had. There were 3 specific things about my mother that mattered more than I understood at the time, things I want you to hold on to. Because all 3 of them come back around later in this story in ways I didn't see coming. The first was the coffee can behind the diner counter, the quiet, undocumented generosity she extended to strangers without ever asking anything in return. The second was that phrase, "We're not rich, and we're not poor, we're taken care of," repeated so many times it had worn smooth, like a stone she carried in her pocket. The third was a family cell phone plan she'd set up years earlier, back when I was in college, a shared account with 4 lines on it. Hers, Carl's, Tommy's, and mine, that she'd started, she told me at the time. So nobody in this family is ever more than a phone call away from help, no matter what happens to anybody's job or anybody's bank account. I paid my own portion of that bill for years without thinking much about the structure underneath it. I would come to think about that structure a great deal, eventually, in a Verizon store on Northeast Broadway. 4 years after I thought I'd walked away from all of it entirely. I graduated from the University of Oregon with a degree in finance, took an entry-level analyst position at a regional firm in Eugene, and within 6 years had worked my way up to a senior analyst role at a larger wealth management firm in Portland, the kind of firm whose lobby has actual art on the walls and whose clients measure their portfolios in 8 figures. I want to be honest that I liked what that trajectory did to how people at the firm perceived me, and I liked it in a specific way that matters to this story. I had built, deliberately, over several years, a version of my own biography for firm consumption that emphasized the bootstrapping, the scholarship, the loans, the working-class Portland roots a partner once used, approvingly, in an internal newsletter profile about me, while quietly omitting the ongoing, present-tense reality that my mother was still, at 58 years old, working double shifts at a diner, and had never once, in my adult life, had what most people at my firm would consider financial security. I let colleagues believe my family's story was a closed chapter, a triumph completed in the past tense. Because the truth, that my mother's precariousness was still active, still ongoing, still capable of reaching into my present life and asking something of me, didn't fit the narrative I'd built my professional identity around. The wrong I did, the one this whole story is built around, started with a phone call from my mother on a Thursday evening in April, roughly 3 years into my time at the Portland firm. She told me, in the careful, slightly apologetic tone she always used whenever she needed to ask for anything, that she'd been diagnosed with a gallbladder condition requiring surgery, that her insurance through the diner covered most of it, but not the specialist consultation, or the 6 weeks of reduced hours she'd need afterward to recover. And that between those two gaps she was short about $4,000, the exact figure, she told me later, that she'd landed on after going through her and Carl's finances line by line for 3 nights before she let herself call me. She wasn't asking me to cover the whole thing. She was asking me to help close a specific, calculated gap, the kind of number that at my salary I could have written a check for that same evening without meaningfully affecting my own life at all. I remember the specific quality of her voice on that call, careful and small, in a way I'd rarely heard from her, and I remember, too, that she apologized twice within the first minute for even having to ask. Saying things like, "I hate that I'm calling you about this, and I know you have your own life," apologies that in hindsight should have told me everything about how much this cost her simply to say out loud, and that instead, in the moment, mostly registered to me as confirmation that the request itself was somehow shameful, a feeling I let attach to her rather than to my own eventual response. I want to describe exactly what I told myself in the days after that call, because I think the reasoning matters more than the guilt does if you actually want to understand how a person does something like this. I told myself that my mother's finances had always been her situation, something I'd grown up around and grown past. And that stepping in now would blur a line I'd worked hard to establish, the line between the daughter who'd escaped that precariousness and the daughter who was still, in some sense, tethered to it. I told myself that $4,000 was a manageable amount for her to figure out through other channels, a payment plan with the hospital, a loan from Carl's side of the family. Anything other than me. Because if it came from me, it would mean the bootstrapping story I'd built my professional identity around had an asterisk on it I wasn't ready for anyone, including myself, to see. I told myself, underneath all of that I was simply setting a boundary, a phrase I'd picked up from a leadership seminar my firm had sent me to that spring. A phrase that let the refusal sound like self-care rather than what it actually was. I also told myself something else, quieter, that I've never said to anyone until now. I told myself that if I helped her this time, there would be a next time, and a time after that, and that saying no now, cleanly, was actually a kind of long-term kindness. Establishing a precedent that would protect us both from an endless cycle of need and rescue. I dressed that reasoning up in language about healthy patterns and not enabling dependency, language that sounds almost clinical when I say it out loud now, applied to a woman asking her only daughter for $4,000 to cover a gallbladder surgery. I want you to sit with how absurd that reasoning actually was, because I think sitting with it honestly is the only way any of what comes later in this story makes sense. There was an off-ramp in that stretch of days, and I want to be honest that I saw it clearly and chose not to take it. My colleague and closest work friend, a woman named Priya Deshmukh, noticed I was distracted during a client meeting that same week and asked me about it afterward over coffee in the firm's break room. I told her in general terms about my mother's request. Priya, who'd grown up with a mother who'd struggled financially herself, said, without hesitating, Maya, "That's nothing to you. You'd spend more than that on the Cabo trip next month. Just send it to her and don't make it a whole thing." I told her it was more complicated than the dollar amount, that there was a lot of history underneath it she didn't understand. Priya looked at me for a second longer than the sentence required and said, "There's always history underneath it. That's not usually a reason not to help somebody." I didn't have a real answer to that. And I let the conversation end anyway, the same way I'd let Priya's earlier comment about my mother's diner job pass without correction 6 months before, when she'd asked, genuinely curious, whether my mom still worked there, and I'd said, "Not really anymore. She's mostly retired," a lie I'd told so smoothly it frightened me a little, later. Thinking back on how easily it had come out, Priya brought it up one more time, 2 days later, in the elevator on our way up from a client lunch, and this time she was more direct than she'd been the first time. "Did you send your mom that money?" she asked. I told her I was still thinking about it. She looked at me, genuinely puzzled, and said, "What's there to think about? You have it. She needs it. That's usually the whole equation." I told her, a little sharply, that it wasn't as simple as an equation, and she held up her hands in mock surrender and said, "Okay, just checking." It seemed simple from the outside. I've thought about that phrase more than almost anything else Priya ever said to me. It seemed simple from the outside, because it was simple. And the only thing complicating it was a story I'd been telling myself for over a decade about who I needed to be in rooms like the one Priya and I worked in every day. I called my mother back that Sunday, 4 days after her original call, and I told her, in a voice I'd rehearsed more than I want to admit, that I wasn't in a position to help with the $4,000, that money was tighter than people assumed given my own expenses, and that she should look into a hospital payment plan or a personal loan through her bank. Both of those things were lies. My finances were not remotely tight. I had, at that point, more than $40,000 sitting in a brokerage account beyond my retirement contributions, money I'd been actively growing for years specifically because growing it made me feel like the version of myself I'd built for public consumption. My mother was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, I understand. I'll figure something out," in the same tone she'd used my entire childhood whenever a plan fell through, a tone with no accusation in it at all, which somehow made what came next feel worse rather than better. She called back 2 days later, and this call was different, not angry exactly, but direct in a way she rarely allowed herself to be with me. "I need to ask you something honestly, Maya, and I need an honest answer," she said. "Is this about the money, or is this about not wanting people at your fancy firm to know your mother waits tables?" I told her that was an unfair thing to say, that it had nothing to do with embarrassment, that I simply wasn't in a position to help right now. She was quiet, and then she said the sentence that ended the conversation, the sentence I've replayed more times than any other sentence in my adult life. "You've been embarrassed of me since you were about 19 years old, and I let it go for a long time. Because I figured you'd grow out of it. I don't think you're going to grow out of it. I think you've just gotten better at hiding it. I told her that wasn't fair, my voice rising in a way it rarely did with her, and the call ended badly, both of us saying things sharper than either of us meant, though I want to be honest and tell you that what I said was sharper than what she said, by a wide margin, and that I knew it in the moment and said it anyway. I told her, near the end of that call, that maybe it would be easier for both of us if I just took some space for a while, and she said, quietly, Maya, don't do that. Whatever you think that's going to fix, it isn't going to fix it. Which I understand now as the last clear, direct thing she said to me before 4 years of silence, and which I dismissed, in the moment, as exactly the kind of guilt-driven pleading I'd convinced myself I was finally strong enough to resist. I blocked her number that same night, sitting on my couch with my phone in my hand, and I want to describe the specific mechanics of that decision because I think they matter. I didn't block her in a moment of pure impulse. I sat with the decision for almost 40 minutes first, turning it over deliberately, telling myself that I needed distance to process, that continued contact in that state would only produce more damage, that blocking her was, in the language of that same leadership seminar, protecting my peace. I want you to understand that I dressed cruelty up in therapeutic language for almost the entire length of that 40 minutes, and that somewhere underneath all of it, I knew exactly what I was actually doing, which was making it structurally impossible for my mother to call me back and make me feel, even once more, the specific shame of having been asked for something small by someone who'd given me everything, and having said no. For the better part of the next 4 years, my life proceeded as though that phone call and the block that followed it had simply resolved something rather than created it. I told colleagues, when the topic came up at all, some version of my mom and I aren't really in touch right now. It's complicated. We're working on it. A sentence vague enough to invite no follow-up questions, and specific enough to sound like a situation with a plan attached, when in reality, there was no plan at all. Just an unlisted number sitting behind a block I renewed my resolve about every time I thought of unblocking it, and then didn't. My career in that same stretch accelerated in almost every measurable way. I made senior analyst 8 months after the block, led a client portfolio restructuring that got written up favorably in an internal firm memo, and started mentoring 2 junior analysts myself, one of whom, a woman named Devon, mentioned once admiringly that she loved how I talked about coming from nothing and building something real. A phrase I let stand without correction, the same way I'd let Priya's assumption stand 2 years earlier, because correcting it would have required explaining a present tense mother I'd made structurally unreachable by my own hand. I remember the specific pride I felt hearing Devon say that. A pride I understand now was built almost entirely on omission, on letting a story about a distant, closed-chapter hardship stand in for a story about an ongoing relationship I'd simply refused to maintain. There were cracks in that 4-year stretch, small enough that I filed each one away rather than examine it directly. About a year in, my Aunt Risa texted me a photo from a family barbecue I hadn't been invited to, or rather hadn't been invited to because nobody knew whether inviting me would just create a scene, and I noticed, looking at the photo longer than I meant to, that my mother looked tired in a way that seemed deeper than a single bad night's sleep. I didn't ask Risa anything about it. 2 years in, Carl reached out to me directly, through a mutual family friend since he had no way to text me himself, to let me know my mother had recovered fully from the gallbladder surgery, the surgery she'd apparently gone through with, financed somehow, without the $4,000 I'd refused her, and I remember feeling a strange, complicated relief mixed with something closer to shame. And I still didn't reach out. 3 years in, at Tommy's high school graduation, an event I did attend because Carl had specifically asked me to, and because Tommy wasn't part of the actual conflict, I sat 4 rows behind my mother the entire ceremony and left before the reception, telling myself I wasn't ready, telling myself there'd be a better moment eventually. A sentence I'd been telling myself for so long by that point that I'd stopped hearing how empty it had become. There was one more crack, closer to the 4-year mark, that I've thought about more than the others since. It was a rainy Tuesday in February, and I was walking to my car after a late meeting when I passed a diner on the other side of downtown, unrelated to the Sunrise Grill. Just an ordinary diner with a lit sign, and I stopped on the sidewalk for almost a full minute, staring at it, thinking about the tuna melt my mother used to make me on slow Saturday afternoons when I was small, before I could actually order for myself, back when she'd just bring it out unasked because she knew exactly what I wanted. I stood there long enough that a stranger asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, and I got in my car and I drove home, and I didn't call her that night either. I want to be honest that I wasn't tormented during those 4 years, which is the detail that troubles me most in retrospect. I wasn't lying awake every night consumed with guilt. I was, by almost every external measure, thriving, respected at the firm, financially secure well beyond what I needed, in a stable relationship with a man named Julian who knew the broad outlines of the estrangement but had never once met my mother and had, I understand now, quietly stopped asking about her after the first year, sensing correctly that the topic closed doors rather than opened them. The absence of my mother from my life didn't announce itself as a daily wound. It became, instead, a low, manageable hum underneath an otherwise full life. Easy enough to compress into a single vague sentence at a dinner party and not think about again until some unplanned reminder, a photo, a graduation. A diner passed on a drive, brought it back to the surface for an hour or two before I let it settle again. I also want to be honest about something Julian said to me once, about 2.5 years into the estrangement, that I brushed off at the time and have thought about often since. We were at a friend's engagement dinner, and someone at the table asked, casually, whether our own families would get along at a wedding someday, and I gave my usual vague deflection. And Julian, later that night in the car, said, quietly, "I've never met your mom, Maya. I don't even know what she sounds like." I told him it was complicated, the same word I used with everyone, and he said, "I know it's complicated. I'm not asking you to uncomplicate it tonight. I just want you to notice that you've been saying it's complicated to me for 2.5 years and I've never once pushed. And I think that's starting to feel less like patience and more like something I'm quietly agreeing to accept as permanent." I didn't have a good response to that either. I remember feeling defensive rather than reflective, which I understand now was the more common of the two reactions I had to almost anything that touched this particular subject during those 4 years. The discovery that finally broke this open didn't come from a document or a stranger's phone call, the way I understand these things sometimes happen in other people's stories. It came from an entirely mundane administrative task, switching my own cell phone carrier, 4 years and 2 months after I'd blocked my mother's number. Because my firm had negotiated a corporate discount through a different provider, and I wanted to take advantage of it before the enrollment window closed. I walked into a Verizon store on Northeast Broadway on a Tuesday afternoon during my lunch break, expecting a 20-minute transaction, and instead sat across from a customer service representative named Marcus, who pulled up my account information and paused, visibly, at something on his screen. "I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly before we do anything," Marcus said, turning the monitor slightly so I could see it. "Your line is currently part of a 4-line family account. The account holder listed is a Linda Bishop. Do you want me to detach your line from that account as part of the carrier switch? Or is that something you need to handle with the account holder first? I told him there had to be some mistake, that I'd been on my own individual plan for years, that I paid my own phone bill through automatic withdrawal from my personal checking account every month. Marcus pulled up the billing history, and what he showed me on that screen is the piece of hard evidence I have never been able to explain away since, no matter how many times I've turned it over. My line had in fact been billed automatically from my checking account every month, for the first several months after I'd set the plan up years earlier in college. But 18 months into that arrangement, a full 2.5 years before I ever blocked my mother's number, back during a stretch in my early 20s when I'd briefly lost a job and fallen behind on several accounts, my automatic payment had failed for 2 consecutive months. And rather than the line being suspended, which is standard, the account showed a manual payment covering both missed months made in cash at a retail location under Linda Bishop's name. From that point forward, every single month, for over 8 years, my portion of that family plan bill had been paid manually, in person, by my mother, at a Verizon store in Southeast Portland, 3 miles from the Sunrise Grill, every single month, including all 49 months since I'd blocked her number, including the months right after her own gallbladder surgery, including, Marcus confirmed after pulling the detailed transaction log, this past month. I asked Marcus, my voice not entirely steady by that point, whether he could show me the exact dates, and he pulled up a scrollable log going back years, the third of every month, without a single missed cycle, a payment ranging between $31 and $34 depending on taxes and fees, made in person, in cash, every single time. I asked him if there had ever been a gap, a single month she'd missed. He scrolled through the entire 8-year history slowly and told me no. Not one. I asked him if he could tell me anything else, payment method, timing, anything. He told me the payments were almost always made on the third of the month, in cash, and that the account notes, which representatives sometimes leave for continuity when a customer requests something specific, included a standing instruction dated back years: please do not contact line 4 regarding account status. Contact primary holder only for any issues. This line stays active no matter what. I asked him to read that note to me twice because I didn't trust that I'd heard it correctly the first time. He read it twice. It said the same thing both times. I sat in that plastic chair across from Marcus for what felt like several minutes without saying anything at all, and I remember him, to his credit, simply letting the silence sit rather than filling it with the kind of customer service small talk that would have been unbearable in that moment. Eventually, he asked, gently, whether I still wanted to proceed with the carrier switch or whether I needed a minute first. I told him I needed a minute. He nodded and stepped away to help another customer, and I sat there alone, staring at a screen showing 8 years of my mother's handwriting essentially, translated into a payment ledger. I asked him, before I left, whether he could print the transaction history for me, the whole 8 years of it, and he did. 5 pages of dense monthly line items that I folded carefully and put in my coat pocket rather than my bag, as though it needed to stay closer to my body than an ordinary document would. I still have those 5 pages. They're in a drawer in my desk at the firm now, not framed, not displayed, just kept. The way I imagine some things are simply meant to be kept rather than shown. I called my Aunt Risa from the parking lot of that Verizon store, my hands unsteady enough that I had to set my coffee down on the roof of my car before I could actually dial. I asked her, without preamble, whether she knew anything about my mother paying my phone bill for 8 years. Risa was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, carefully, the way people talk when they're deciding how much of someone else's private choice they have the right to reveal. She never wanted you to know, Maya. She used to say, and I'm going to tell you exactly what she said, because I think you need to hear it plainly. She used to say, if Maya's ever in real trouble in an emergency with no one else to call, I want her phone to still work. I want that number to still be hers. I don't care if she never calls it to reach me. I just need to know that if the day comes when she needs to reach anybody at all, she has a way to do it. And it's not going to be a way I took from her, because we're not speaking. I asked Risa the question I most needed answered, my voice barely functioning by that point, whether my mother had kept paying that bill even after the block, even knowing I'd shut her out completely. Even during the 4 years when there was no chance, structurally, that I would ever call that number to reach her specifically. Especially then, Risa said. She told me once, maybe 2 years into it, that the blocking didn't change anything for her, because the phone was never really about whether the two of you were speaking. It was about you never being unreachable to the rest of the world because of something that happened between the two of you. She said, that's not a punishment I'm willing to hand down to my own daughter, even if she's handed me one. Risa told me one more thing before we hung up, something she said she'd debated telling me for years and had decided, finally, that I needed to hear now that I already knew the rest. There was a stretch, maybe 3 years ago, when your mother's own hours got cut back at the diner, new owner came in, trimmed the schedule, and money was tighter than it had been in a long time. Carl told her, more than once, that maybe it was time to let your line go. Since you weren't speaking anyway and $30 a month was $30 a month. She wouldn't do it. She picked up 2 extra breakfast shifts a week instead, specifically to cover it, and she never told you any of that, and she made both Carl and me promise not to either. I sat with that arithmetic for a long time in that parking lot. My mother, a woman I had cut off completely, deliberately, with full awareness of what I was doing, had spent 8 years, the last 4 of them entirely one-directional, entirely unrewarded, entirely unacknowledged, making a monthly trip in cash to guarantee that the daughter who'd refused her $4,000 during a medical crisis and then made herself permanently unreachable would never once lose the basic infrastructure of a functioning phone number because of anything I had done to her. She had, at one point, picked up additional shifts at 58 years old specifically to protect a line I'd used, among other things, to block her. I misjudged what my mother was capable of continuing to give, and more specifically, I misjudged my own understanding of what the block had actually accomplished, because I had spent 4 years believing it had cleanly ended something, drawn a hard line that protected both of us from further damage. The actual truth, it turned out, was that I had only succeeded in ending my ability to see what she was still doing. The line itself, the actual functional connection between us, had never fully closed at all. She'd simply kept holding her end of it open, in total silence, at a cost to her own limited resources that she never once presented to me, then or since, as evidence of anything. I thought back to the coffee can behind the diner counter, the strangers who never had to ask twice. This one's on the house today, don't make a thing of it, and understood, sitting in that parking lot, that I had spent 33 years watching my mother extend exactly this kind of quiet, undocumented protection to people who weren't even her family, and had somehow failed to recognize, until a Verizon store forced the recognition on me. That she had been extending an even larger version of the same instinct to me the entire time, structured so carefully that I never once had to feel its weight. I thought, too, about the phrase she'd repeated my whole childhood, "We're not rich, and we're not poor. We're taken care of," and understood it now as something closer to a covenant than a comfort. She hadn't been describing our bank balance. She'd been describing a promise she was making, silently, to make sure it stayed true, for as long as she had any ability to make it true, even for a daughter who'd stopped believing the promise applied to her at all. I also thought, sitting in that parking lot, about the childhood resentment I'd carried toward Tommy for splitting my mother's attention, and understood, with a clarity that made my chest tighten, that the same possessive instinct had somehow flipped entirely inside out by adulthood, that instead of resenting her for giving less of herself to me, I had spent 4 years actively refusing to let her give anything at all, and she had simply found a way to keep giving anyway, quietly, around the refusal, the way water finds its way around a stone placed deliberately in its path. There is no single dramatic confrontation scene in this story, because the phone that would have made one possible had been blocked by my own hand for 4 years. What I did instead, that same afternoon, sitting in my car outside the Verizon store, was unblock the number I'd frozen out of my life on a Thursday night 4 years earlier and call it directly for the first time since that call, with no rehearsed sentence prepared, no leadership seminar language available to soften what I needed to say. She answered on the second ring. I don't think either of us said anything for almost 5 full seconds. Then she said, simply, Maya, not a question, just my name, delivered in a voice that had clearly been ready for this call for longer than I'd known to expect it. I know about the phone bill, I said. I know you've been paying it this whole time. She was quiet again, and then she said, I wasn't going to tell you. I figured you'd find out eventually, or you wouldn't, and either way, it wasn't really about you finding out. I asked her why she'd kept doing it, especially after the block, especially when there was no chance I'd ever use that line to call her back. Because you're still my daughter whether or not you're speaking to me, she said. That doesn't turn off just because you blocked a number. I don't know how else to explain it to you except that simply. I asked her, my voice breaking in a way I hadn't let it break in front of anyone in years, why she hadn't at least told Carl to tell me, why she'd let me believe, for 4 years, that I'd successfully cut her off completely. Because I didn't want you coming back out of guilt, she said. I wanted you to come back because you wanted to. If you knew I was still paying it, you might have called just to make it stop, out of pride, not because you actually missed me. I'd rather wait longer for the real thing. I want you to hear that sentence the way I heard it, because I think it's the truest thing anyone has ever said to me about the difference between an apology given freely and an apology extracted through guilt, and I think my mother understood that distinction with a clarity I, with my finance degree and my client presentations, had never once managed to articulate for myself. The repair since that phone call has been slower than I wanted it to be, and I've come to think that's appropriate rather than unfortunate. I offered, in that first conversation, to pay her back for 8 years of phone bills, close to $1,900 by Marcus's estimate once we added it up together later. She said no, in the same firm tone Risa had quoted to me in the parking lot. That's not a debt, Maya. If you pay me back for it, you're telling me you think of it as a loan I made you, and it was never that. It was just me being your mother. I don't send an invoice for that, and I'm not going to start now. I asked her then what she would accept instead, because I needed to give her something, needed the gesture to land somewhere concrete rather than dissolve into an apology she'd have every right to receive skeptically. She thought about it for a long moment and said, come to the diner. Not for a big reunion, just come sit at the counter on a Tuesday, order the tuna melt like you used to, and let me see you eating something I made with my own hands again. That's the only currency I actually want. I went the following Tuesday. I sat at the counter, the same counter she'd worked behind for 26 years, and ordered the tuna melt, and she made it herself, and set it down in front of me without ceremony. The same way she used to slide the coffee can discount across to a stranger having a hard month. We didn't have a long, tearful conversation that first visit. We talked about Tommy's first semester at community college, about Carl's knee replacement scheduled for the fall, about ordinary things, and I understood, sitting there, that ordinary things were exactly what she wanted from me before anything larger. That trust gets rebuilt in tuna melts and Tuesday afternoons far more reliably than it gets rebuilt in a single grand apology delivered once and expected to cover everything retroactively. I also told Priya. That same week I corrected the mostly retired lie. The full story of the $4,000 and the block and the 8 years of quiet payments, more detail than I'd given anyone at the firm before. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, simply, "I'm glad you told me. I'm not going to pretend I'm not a little hurt you let me believe the easier version for so long. But I get why you did it." I told her I understood if that changed anything about how she saw me. She said, "It changes what I know about you. It doesn't change how I see you." Those aren't the same thing, Maya. I've thought about that distinction almost as much as I've thought about anything my mother has said to me since this all came out. I think Priya was right that they're different. I think most of what I got wrong for 4 years came from treating them as though they were the same. I asked my mother that first Tuesday back at the diner counter, near the end of the meal, whether she'd ever come close to giving up on the phone bill, on me, on any of it, in 4 years. She thought about the question seriously before answering, which I'd come to expect from her by then. She never gave me the easy version of an answer just to make a moment more comfortable. "There were a few months, maybe 2 years in, where I thought about it," she said. "Not giving up on you exactly. More like giving up on the idea that it would ever get explained to you. That you'd ever know. I made peace, for a while, with the idea that I'd just keep doing it quietly forever, and you'd never know, and that would have to be enough on its own." I asked her if that would have actually been enough. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "No, but I was prepared to let it be enough if it had to be." That's different from it actually being enough. She paused, then added, more quietly than anything else she'd said that afternoon, "I used to picture you finding out by accident someday, the way you actually did. I never let myself picture you finding out and not caring. I don't know what I would have done with that version of the story. I'm glad I never had to find out. I've been back to that counter almost every week since, for 4 months now. My mother still hasn't asked me for anything else, not once, not even indirectly, and I've come to understand that this too is deliberate on her part, that she's giving me the space to offer things on my own timeline rather than training me, through repeated requests to associate her presence in my life with obligation again. I did, on my own, without her asking, finally tell Priya the truth about my mother's job, correcting the mostly retired lie I'd told years earlier, and Priya, to her credit, just said, "Good." I always thought there was more to that story, and let it go without making me explain further. I also sat down with Devon, the junior analyst who'd once admired my coming from nothing and building something real story, and told her the more complicated, more honest version, that I hadn't built it alone at all, that a woman working double shifts at a diner had quietly built most of the foundation underneath me, including, for 8 years, the very phone line I used to run my own career. I introduced Julian to her, finally, at a small dinner at my apartment about 3 months after the Verizon store. Nothing elaborate, just the 4 of us, my mother, Carl, Julian, and me, around my own kitchen table for once instead of the diner counter. My mother brought a container of her own cooking anyway, unprompted, the same way she used to slip extra food across the counter to strangers. And afterward, Julian told me, in the car, that he finally understood something about me he'd been unable to name for years, just from watching the two of us clear the table together. I didn't ask him to elaborate. I think I understood exactly what he meant without needing him to say it. He did ask me one thing, though, before we got home that night, whether I'd finally told her about him properly. Not just the fact of him, but what he actually meant to me, and I told him I had, weeks earlier, on the phone, and that she'd said only, "Good, bring him around then. I want to see how he takes his coffee." Which is, I've come to learn, about as warm a welcome as my mother is capable of extending to someone she hasn't fed with her own hands yet. I also reached out to Tommy directly, about a month after the Verizon store, something I hadn't really done as an adult beyond the occasional obligatory holiday text. I took him to lunch near his community college campus, just the two of us, and told him honestly that I was sorry for the years I'd effectively been absent from his life, too. Not just our mothers, since he'd been caught in the middle of an estrangement that had nothing to do with him. He was gracious about it in the specific, slightly awkward way 20-year-olds are gracious about things that happened mostly before they were old enough to fully understand them. "I always figured you'd come back eventually," he said, stirring his soda with a straw, not quite looking at me. "Mom always said you would." I didn't always believe her, but she never stopped saying it. I asked him if that had been hard for him, watching her keep believing something he wasn't sure was true. He shrugged, the specific shrug of a younger sibling who'd learned early not to complicate his mother's hopes out loud. "A little, but it's not like she made it your fault out loud, so I didn't really have anywhere to put being annoyed about it, if that makes sense." I think sometimes about what would have happened if I'd simply written the check that April $4,000 I wouldn't have missed instead of dressing my embarrassment up as a boundary. I don't know that it would have changed the deeper pattern underneath all of it, the years of quietly hiding my mother from my professional identity, the discomfort with her that predated the phone call by well over a decade. I know it would have meant she didn't spend 4 years making a cash payment in a Verizon store every month for a daughter who'd made herself completely unreachable. Wondering, I imagine, on at least some of those third-of-the-month afternoons, whether the daughter on the other end of that silent line would ever actually come back, or whether she was simply going to keep paying, indefinitely, into an account that led nowhere. I don't want to end this sounding like everything between us is fully resolved, because I don't think it is. And claiming otherwise would be its own small dishonesty, the exact kind that got me here in the first place. My mother and I are closer now than we've been since I was a teenager, sitting at the end of that diner counter doing homework, and I still catch myself, occasionally, reaching for the old vague language. "It's complicated. We're working on it," before I catch the reflex and correct it out loud, usually to whoever I'm talking to, sometimes just to myself. I don't think that reflex disappears completely once you've spent over a decade building an identity partly out of distance from the person who made you. I think you just get better, slowly, week by week, tuna melt by tuna melt, at noticing the reflex before it wins. My mother turns 59 this year, and Carl mentioned recently, in the easy, sideways way he mentions most things, that she's finally agreed to cut back to 4 shifts a week instead of 5, now that Tommy's tuition is more settled, and now that, I suspect, though neither of them have said it directly, she doesn't feel like she needs to be quite as financially braced for emergencies I might create. I offered, a few weeks ago, to help cover the difference in her income if cutting back put any strain on her and Carl's budget. She said, in the same firm tone she's used for every other offer of repayment I've made since that Tuesday in the Verizon store, "I'll let you know if I need it." That's different from you deciding I need it before I've said so. I've stopped arguing with that particular distinction. I think it's the most important thing she's ever tried to teach me, and I think it took me 33 years and a phone bill to actually start learning it. The thing I'd say to you, If you recognize any part of yourself in this, is that blocking someone doesn't actually end what they're willing to do for you. It only ends your ability to see it happening. My mother never once let my worst decision about her become the final word on what she was willing to give me, and the debt for that particular kind of love doesn't disappear just because you spent 4 years unable to see the bill arriving, on the third of every month, paid quietly, in cash, by someone you'd made absolutely certain could never call you back to ask for anything in return. I keep those 5 printed pages from the Verizon store in my desk drawer at work. And every so often, on a hard day, when a client is difficult or a deal falls through, or I catch myself slipping back into some version of the old careful management of who I let people believe I am, I take them out and read through them again, all those third-of-the-month entries in a row. And I remember exactly what it looked like when somebody decided, unilaterally and without asking my permission, that I was still worth showing up for. I don't think that's a comfortable thing to keep close. I think it's supposed to be uncomfortable. I think the discomfort is the whole point of keeping it. The same way my mother kept a coffee can behind a diner counter for 26 years. Not because it was easy to keep filling, but because some things are only worth doing if you're willing to keep doing them without being asked twice. If this story moved you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more honest, family-centered stories.